Hey everybody, in this series of lectures, the last podcast for the semester, I want to talk about Reconstruction and continue my discussion on Reconstruction. Again, it's one of the most complicated periods of U.S. history because it zigzags. Just to repeat, when we started, or where I started after the Civil War, somewhat surprisingly, ex-Confederates regained power very quickly in the South. This is because the man who became president after Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, ended up supporting Southern whites and wealthy Southern whites, ex-Confederates, for his own political reasons and because he was deeply racist. Now, we don't know what Lincoln would have done, but I think almost certainly he wouldn't have gone to the lengths that Andrew Johnson did to align himself with the power brokers in the ex-Confederacy, but we'll never know. This is what Johnson did. So this is, I think, one of the surprising things about the Reconstruction period, that in the first year or so after the war, ex-Confederates, who were all white, regained power in the South. Then, once they regained power, or as part of this process, all the Southern states were asked to write new constitutions that recognized that slavery was over. So in the technical aspect of this is, in order to send up 2 senators to Washington and your number of representatives to the House of Representatives, in order to come back into the U.S. government, Andrew Johnson required these states to write new constitutions. These new constitutions were written by whites with no African American voice. They included the black codes that I talked about at great length in my last podcast, which was a system of laws. It took various forms in various states, but the big picture was it was a system of laws that was designed to control both the labor of ex-slaves, tie them to the land through these written contracts, and also the behavior and the movement of ex-slaves as well. And local law enforcement authorities were quite central to this effort, because if you stepped out of line, for instance, if you wrote a contract to work with a white plantation owner after the Civil War, if you're an ex-slave, and then you broke that contract, you could be arrested. It became illegal. There were things, apprentice laws, which I talked about for minors, vagrancy laws, which you could be arrested for almost anything and then leased out to a white farmer. Just a whole system of legislation that was designed to enmesh African Americans in a labor system that wasn't slavery, but it was kind of an echo of the slavery system. It was a series of laws designed to do that. And in addition, you start having violence against African Americans, most notably in New Orleans in the summer of '66, mass murder of African Americans that were meeting to protest these black codes in Louisiana, that were agitating for African American vote. You had another massacre of African Americans in Nashville, Tennessee during that period. And the northern whites began to grow more and more hostile to Southern whites. I think after the Civil War, most Northern whites, it was kind of a live and let live situation. The Union had been re-established. They were moderate. But what happens is by the summer of 1866, a year after the Civil War, more and more Northern whites, at least a majority anyway, are quite angry at the overreach of the white South in the period after the Civil War. What this means politically is that the radical wing of the Republican Party, which is the more pro-African American wing of the Republican Party, wanting to give African Americans the right to vote, wanting to help them through the agencies such as the Freedmen's Bureau, which offered education and food, kind of an early social assistance state to African Americans. and also looked at the white South much more critically, it becomes ascendant. And moderate Republicans who had been, again, kind of a live and let live when it came to the white South after the Civil War, they become radicalized by the actions of the white South by the summer of 1866. So once again, you have a movement in people's ideas where moderates move to the left. They move over to the radical side. Of course, the big problem is Andrew Johnson is the president at this time. And what you have basically is a conflict between the executive branch, i.e. Andrew Johnson, who was very pro-Southern white, very much willing to let Southern whites run the show in the South. He doesn't care about the black codes. He wants to win re-election in 1868 versus Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And remember, this is a Congress in which only the states of the Union are represented because the Congress has rejected the senators and the representatives that the South has sent up after the rewriting of these constitutions. So what you have is a war between Congress, which is more and more radicalized and more moves towards radical Republicans, and the presidency. Okay, this all comes to a head in the election of 1866. And in the election of 1866, Johnson tries to gain more support in the Congress, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives. And radicals do the same. And what the radicals want is they want to gain a veto-proof majority in the Congress, in the Senate, and in the House of Representatives, which means that they have to have 2/3 plus one. Because any veto, any presidential veto of any kind of legislation can be overturned by a 2/3 vote. So these are the stakes in the 1866 election. It's probably one of the most important off-year elections in U.S. history. So Johnson, very, very famously, he goes, it's called Round the Circle. He goes and campaigns all over the North. But his campaign is kind of a disaster. Johnson himself is kind of a disaster as a person, as a personality. At times, he compares himself to Jesus Christ. He says that just like Christ was martyred for his forgiveness or his belief in forgiveness, that Andrew Johnson was being martyred by the radicals because Andrew Johnson believed that Southern whites should be forgiven. Again, Johnson doesn't care at all about the ex-slaves. And it's a very self-pitying campaign on Johnson's part. Again, he's not running for president, but he's running so he can at least stop the radicals from creating a veto-proof majority in the House and the Senate. Long story short, Johnson is destroyed, or his political hopes are destroyed in the election of 1866. The moderates and the radicals, who are now aligned themselves, the Republicans, do gain a veto-proof majority in the Congress after the election of 1866. So this, in what will happen is this Congress, this veto-proof Congress, will start meeting in early 1867, right? Because there's always a delay between the election and the meeting of a new Congress, kind of like there's a delay in the election of the president and the president taking office on January 20th. So here's what we have is Reconstruction, or what we call radical Reconstruction, or congressional Reconstruction, doesn't begin until 1867 because of all the things that I've laid out over the last couple of podcasts. So there's surprisingly a 2-year delay between the end of the Civil War and attempts especially to enfranchise, to give ex-slaves some political and social rights in the South. And I think that's one of the really complicated things about Reconstruction. One would assume that this would all happen right after the war, right? That there wouldn't be any kind of delay whatsoever. But that's not true at all. Because of Lincoln's assassination and Andrew Johnson, his kind of flavor of presidency, the overreach of Southern whites, there's a 2-year time lag. So what you need to know is that by 1867, 2 years after the Civil War ends, there's a whole new ball game when it comes to Reconstruction. And power slips from Andrew Johnson into the hands of the Congress. And the Congress, it has a 2/3 majority. It can override any one of Johnson's vetoes. That's one of the ways he had kind of controlled the process. He could veto legislation he didn't like. But by 1867, the ball game has changed. The landscape has changed. Moderates and Republicans now have a 2/3 majority in the Senate and the House, and they can pretty much do what they want. So where I'm going to stop now is 1867, and that's when Reconstruction takes on a completely different shape. What happens, we're starting to see the granting of citizenship to African Americans, the granting of the vote to African Americans. It's a huge moment, really a revolutionary moment in U.S. history. But it doesn't happen until 1867, until all of the events that I've laid out occur. And this is one of the things you're going to have to figure out how to talk about in your evaluation. I want to see in your evaluation that you have an understanding of the events right after the Civil War, what we would call presidential Reconstruction. That's when Andrew Johnson is running things, up until 1867, when now the Republicans in Congress control the show because they have the 2/3 majority, and they start passing legislation that is much more positive for ex-slaves, and from the point of view of ex-Confederates, much more negative.